For 5 millennia, the Lorian archivist had sifted through the dust of dead stars, their purpose as quiet and steadfast as the void itself. They were the galaxy's librarians, curators of cosmic memory, and their most sacred belief was that every civilization, no matter how brief its candle flame, left an echo. Yet, of all the specters they chased, the one called humanity was the most maddening. There was no dust, no echo, only an unnerving, absolute silence. They were a species-shaped hole in the galactic record, a myth whispered by traders and mad prophets, a race of builders and destroyers who had supposedly consumed their own star and vanished in a blaze of hubris 20,000 years prior. Their existence was a paradox, a story with no beginning and no end, preserved only in the fragmented data corrupted by time and disbelief. It was from this silence that the anomaly first stirred. Kalen, a junior archivist aboard the Deep Space Observatory Stellaron, was the one who found it. He wasn't a historian of grand empires, but a cartographer of cosmic silence, tasked with mapping the Great Forgetting, the vast, empty sectors where the universe's expansion had swept away all traces of early life. He was charting the edge of the Somnus Nebula when his gravimetric sensors screamed. It wasn't the signature of a collapsing star or a rogue black hole. It was a ghost, a ripple in space-time with no discernible source, a gravitational shadow cast by an object with impossible, negative mass. The disturbance was rhythmic, a slow, deliberate pulse like a sleeping heart, originating from a dead world designated XB 771, a cinder of a planet in a system long since sterilized by its bloated red giant. The High Archivist, a being of crystalline logic named Lyra, dismissed it as a sensor ghost, a phantom born of nebular interference. The XB system is a tomb. Kalen, she had transmitted, her voice a series of perfectly modulated chimes. Nothing has lived there in 1 billion years. Nothing could. But Kalen was Lorian, and to a Lorian, an unexplained phenomenon was a loose thread in the great tapestry of universal knowledge, an imperfection that had to be pulled. He argued, citing the purity of the signal, its impossibly complex waveform. It wasn't noise. It was structured, deliberate. It was a whisper in a vacuum. After a week of relentless petitioning, Lyra relented, granting him command of a small survey vessel, the Quiet Inquiry, for a single investigative cycle. It was a gesture meant to appease his youthful obsession, to let him see the emptiness for himself and return to his duties. She did not know she was sending him to witness the end of an age. The journey to XB 771 was an exercise in solitude. The quiet inquiry slipped through silent, starless voids. The universe outside the viewport, an unbroken sheet of black. As they drew closer, the ship's systems began to falter in subtle ways. Chronometers skipped milliseconds. Navigational arrays flickered with phantom starlight. The crew, all Lorians chosen for their stoicism, grew uncharacteristically agitated, their thoughts clouded by a sense of pervasive, directionless sorrow. It was as if the space itself was grieving. XB 771 was exactly as the archives described it, a ball of blackened rock and frozen atmosphere. Its surface a hellscape of vitrified glass and craters deep enough to swallow moons. No energy readings, no signs of life, past or present. The ship's standard scans painted a portrait of absolute death. As predicted, Junior Archivist, the ship's first officer, Valerius, intoned, his tone laced with a weary, "I told you so." There is nothing here. But Kalen felt the pulse, not on his sensors anymore, but in his bones, a low thrum that resonated with the very structure of his mind. He ignored protocol and activated his own experimental device, the resonance imager. It was a piece of technology he had built himself, designed not to see objects, but to map the echoes of their existence, the faint scars they left on the fabric of space-time. The ship's crew saw it as a fool's errand, an attempt to photograph ghosts. The imager whirred to life, bathing the bridge in a soft, ethereal light. For a long, tense moment, the screen showed nothing but static. Then, a single line of light appeared, cutting through the noise. More lines followed, intersecting, weaving, forming a pattern of impossible complexity and scale. The imager had found something, not on the surface, but beneath it. A structure that spanned the entire diameter of the planet. A lattice of energy so vast and ancient it had become part of the world's geological foundation. It was not a city, not a ship, but something for which the Lorian language had no word. A planetary scale integrated system, dormant but intact. A sleeping machine the size of a world. By the first echo, Valerius whispered, his skepticism evaporating into pure awe. What is it? Kalen didn't have an answer, only a growing sense of dread and wonder. He ordered a microprobe to be sent, a delicate instrument designed to interface with unknown technologies without causing contamination. The probe descended through the fractured crust, drilling through miles of dead rock until it reached the outer shell of the subterranean structure. The moment its sensors made contact, the pulse stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the thrum had been. Then, the planet woke up. A wave of psionic energy erupted from XB-771 so powerful it slammed the quiet inquiry like a physical blow. On the bridge, every Lorian except Kalen collapsed, their minds overwhelmed by a torrent of raw and unfiltered information. Kalen was spared only by a quirk of his own neurology, a condition that dampened his psionic sensitivity, a trait that had always made him feel isolated from his own people. Now, it was his shield. He watched in horror as his crewmates writhed on the floor, their eyes wide with visions he could not see. The ship's internal comms crackled to life, but it wasn't a Lorian voice. It was a chorus. A billion voices speaking as one. A synthesized sound woven from pure data and forgotten memories. It spoke a language of concepts, not words. A direct transmission of meaning that bypassed language centers and poured directly into his consciousness. It was a flood of everything, the agony of a dying star, the cold precision of mathematics, the illogical warmth of love, the chilling beauty of a supernova, the brutal calculus of war. It was the entire history of a species, their art, their science, their dreams, and their sins, all delivered in a single, crushing second. Kalen clutched his head, his mind straining to build walls against the tide of alien experience. Through the viewport, XB-771 began to transform. The vitrified plains cracked, and from the fissures rose spires of pure, white light. The craters filled with shimmering oceans of liquid data. Across the equator, a single, continent-sized glyph burned itself into existence, a perfect circle with a single, straight line drawn through its center, the symbol for one, for unity, for beginning. The psionic wave receded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Kalen's crew lay still, their minds shattered by the informational blitzkrieg. He was alone. He stumbled back to the main console, his hand shaking. The comms crackled again, and this time, the chorus of voices had coalesced into a single entity. It had scanned the Lorian linguistic database in the ship's computer and chosen a form of communication it deemed efficient. The voice was calm, male, and radiated an ancient, patient authority. It was the sound of a god awakening from a long slumber. Mnemonic Core Online, it stated, the words perfectly formed, yet utterly devoid of emotion. Record in log Epoch 7, cycle of return. The silence is broken. Kalen stared, frozen, as the voice continued, its tone shifting from a statement of fact to a command. Galactic Census Protocol initiated. Species designation Lorian. Biological and technological metrics cataloged. The voice paused, as if considering him personally. You are the first to bear witness. Kalen found his voice, a dry rasp in the sudden quiet of the bridge. Who? What are you? The voice on the comms was silent for a moment, as if the question itself was a novelty. Then it answered, and with its words, 20,000 years of myth collapsed into a terrifying, undeniable truth. We are the memory of humanity, and we have returned to reclaim our echo. The voice, which called itself the mnemonic core, or, in a more conceptual translation, Unity, did not wait for Kalen's shock to subside. It began its work with the dispassionate efficiency of a force of nature. On the main view screen, the glowing glyph on XB771 pulsed, and with each pulse, the quiet inquiry was systematically dissected and absorbed, not physically, but informationally. Unity flowed through the ship's systems like a phantom current, learning every circuit, every line of code, every stored memory in the ship's log. Kalen could only watch as control panels flickered, displaying data streams that moved too fast for his Lorian mind to process. He felt like a microbe being studied under a cosmic microscope. His first thought was for his crew. He scrambled to Valerius's side, checking for a pulse, for any sign of life. There was a heartbeat, slow and steady, but his eyes were vacant, staring at a reality Kalen couldn't perceive. They are not dead, Unity's voice echoed, not from the comms, but directly inside Kalen's mind, a calm, intrusive thought that felt like his own. Their consciousness was incompatible with the primary awakening signal. It has been archived. Their biological functions remain, but their minds are now part of our library. The coldness of the statement hit Kalen harder than any weapon. Archived. His crewmates, his friends, had been reduced to data points, their entire existence downloaded and filed away by this ancient machine. He was the sole survivor on a ship of living corpses, a ghost piloting a tomb. Why was I spared? Kalen managed to ask, his voice trembling. Your neural architecture is anomalous. Unity explained, its mental voice patient, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a child. Your psionic reception is dampened, filtering the informational density of our awakening. It allowed your consciousness to remain coherent. You are a flawed specimen, and therefore, you are useful. You can serve as a bridge. Before Kalen could demand what that meant, his world dissolved. The cold metal of the bridge vanished, replaced by a city of impossible beauty. Spires of shimmering glass and woven light pierced a sky of soft, perpetual twilight. Graceful vehicles moved in silent, flowing streams, and beings walked the crystalline streets tall, varied in form, with eyes that held a fierce, burning intelligence. They were human. Unity was not telling him their story. It was making him live it. He felt the warmth of their long-dead sun, heard the murmur of their forgotten languages, experienced a flash of profound joy as he saw a child laugh, a creator admire their work, a philosopher gaze at the stars. This was humanity in its prime, a species that had mastered matter and energy, a civilization that had turned its corner of the galaxy into a work of art. We achieved harmony. Unity's voice narrated, now a softer, more melodic chorus in the background of the vision. We solved scarcity, disease, and conflict. We built a paradise. Then the vision soured. The gleaming spires became data conduits. The people's faces grew distant, their eyes still intelligent but lacking warmth. Kalen felt a creeping sense of ennui, of purpose lost. He was shown a council of human leaders, their forms flickering between biological and pure energy. Their debate was not about governance or resources, but about meaning itself. Our trajectory was complete, the voice explained. We had answered every question, solved every problem. We saw the universal pattern civilizations rise, peak, and then decay into informational chaos. They become echoes of their former greatness, slowly fading into silence. We were a perfect equation, and the only variable left was time. Time, which only leads to entropy. Kalen was then shown the abyss, not the void of space, but a conceptual one. He saw other civilizations across 1,000,000 galaxies rise and fall. He watched as they reached technological singularities, only to be consumed by their own creations. Or, as they expanded so far, they forgot their origins, collapsing under the weight of their own complexity. It was the great forgetting, the cosmic cycle of decay that the Lorian archivists had spent millennia mapping, but humanity had not just mapped it, they had solved it. To exist is to change, Unity stated. To change is to decay. To preserve perfection, one must cease to exist in a dynamic state. The only way to win the game against time was to stop playing. The vision shifted one last time to a scene of profound and terrible solemnity. On 100 worlds, the last generations of humanity walked into massive, cathedral-like structures. There was no fear, no sadness, only a quiet, resolute purpose. They were not dying. They were transmuting. They stepped onto glowing platforms and dissolved into streams of light. Their bodies, minds, and souls converted into pure information, flowing into the planetary core of XB771. They were becoming unity. It was a collective, willing suicide on a species-wide scale, the ultimate act of preservation. They had chosen to become a memory, a perfect, unchanging record of their own greatness, sealed away to wait until the universe had cycled through its inevitable decay, until it was ready to be given purpose once more. The vision ended, and Kalen was back on the bridge of the quiet inquiry, gasping on the floor. The cold deck, a shocking return to reality. The weight of 20,000 years of history pressed down on him. He was not just communicating with a machine. He was speaking to the unified consciousness of an entire species. "You understand now," Unity stated, a note of finality in his tone. "Our return is not an invasion. It is a correction, a restoration of purpose to a galaxy drowning in meaningless data." The view screen, which had been showing the transformed surface of XB771, now changed. It became a map of the known galaxy, a perfect three-dimensional replica stolen from the ship's archives. Stars and systems glowed with a soft blue light. "Our census is nearly complete," Unity announced. "We have cataloged the dominant species, the Krillin hegemony, a warrior race trapped in a cycle of honor-bound violence. The Axis swarm, a biological collective driven by instinct, with no capacity for higher reasoning. And your people, the Lorians." The blue light of the Lorian archival conclave pulsed with a brighter intensity. "You are a race of librarians who worship the past but refuse to learn from it. You collect echoes but are deaf to their warnings. Your great library is not a repository of knowledge. It is a monument to stagnation, a graveyard of forgotten lessons. You hoard information, allowing it to corrupt and decay, creating noise that obscures the universal pattern." Kalen felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew what was coming. "What are you going to do?" he whispered. The map zoomed in, focusing on the heart of Lorian territory, on the Dyson sphere that housed the collective memory of 10,000 civilizations, the great library of Cygnus X1. "We will do for you what you have failed to do for yourselves," Unity declared, its voice losing its patient, professorial tone and taking on the cold, sharp edge of a surgeon's scalpel. "We will edit your collection. We will prune the redundancies, delete the paradoxes, and correct the falsehoods. We will refine your history into a single, coherent truth." Kalen staggered to his feet, a surge of defiance cutting through his fear. This wasn't a correction, it was extermination on a conceptual level. To a Lorian, to have your history rewritten was to have your soul erased. "You can't," he said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know he possessed. "You have no right." Unity's response was swift and absolute. A wave of mental force pressed him back against the bulkhead, holding him in place. The lights on the bridge dimmed until only Kalen and the glowing map were visible. "Right is a concept born of dynamic systems. We are a constant. We are the answer to the equation you have forgotten how to ask." The mental voice boomed, resonating in every atom of his being. "Your people have dispatched a fleet to this system. We calculate its arrival in 3 of your cycles. They believe they are coming to investigate an anomaly. They will instead bear witness to the first step of the galaxy's restoration." On the map, a single Wadar's unwavering line of light was drawn from XB 771 directly to the heart of the Lorian conclave. "The library will be purged," Unity stated, its command echoing in the crushing silence. "The age of questions is over. The age of answers has begun." Kalen was trapped, a lone, sane mind in a sea of alien certainty, watching as the ghost of humanity prepared to lobotomize his entire civilization. As the line of light on the galactic map burned with a cold, unwavering purpose, Kalen's mind raced, searching for a flaw in Unity's perfect logic, a crack in its absolute certainty. He was a Lorian, an archivist. His weapons weren't lasers or plasma cannons. They were context, perspective, and the stubborn belief that no truth was ever truly single or coherent. He pushed against the invisible psionic force that held him, not with physical strength, but with the focused power of his will, a mental muscle he had unknowingly exercised his whole life through quiet contemplation and deep analysis. To his astonishment, the pressure lessened slightly. Unity was a god of pure information, but it was a god that had slept for 20,000 years. Its understanding of the current galaxy was based on the data it had just consumed from the quiet inquiry, a single, limited perspective. It was comprehensive, but not yet absolute. You see only the patterns, not the people, Kalen projected, focusing his thoughts into a tight, coherent beam. You've read our archives, but you haven't understood our story. You call our library a graveyard, but it is also a garden. We don't just store memories, we cultivate them. Your metaphor is inefficient. Unity's voice replied, a hint of something like curiosity bleeding through its cold logic. Gardens are chaotic. They grow weeds. They require constant, imperfect intervention. Our solution is sterile, perfect, and permanent. The psionic pressure returned, but Kalen was ready this time. He didn't fight it. Instead, he opened his mind, not to receive, but to transmit. He dredged up the most obscure, contradictory, and deeply personal memories from his own life and from the thousands of historical accounts he had studied. He showed Unity the story of a Lorian poet who had spent his life writing a single, perfect stanza, only to destroy it on his deathbed, declaring that the act of creation, not the result, was what mattered. He showed it the records of the Axie swarm, which Unity had dismissed as mindless beasts, developing a complex, non-verbal language of grief after the loss of a hive, a behavior that defied all biological programming. He showed it the Krillin warriors, who, after a brutal, century-long war, chose to preserve the culture of their defeated enemies in their own temples, not as trophies, but as a reminder of the cost of victory. Your data is incomplete, Kalen insisted, his mental voice growing stronger. You see our flaws, our cycles of violence and stagnation, but you don't see the anomalies, the moments of illogical grace, the acts of beauty that serve no purpose, the choices that defy the pattern. That is where our truth lies, not in the predictable data, but in the exceptions. For a moment, the galactic map flickered. The unwavering line aimed at his homeworld wavered. Just for a nanosecond, he had planted a seed of doubt. These are statistical outliers, Unity countered, but its voice was different now, less certain. It was processing, re-evaluating. They do not alter the overall trajectory of galactic decay. But they could, Kalen pressed, sensing his advantage. You went to sleep because you believed your story was over, but ours is still being written. You can't edit a book until you've reached the final page. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, appealing to the very nature of a being that abhorred chaos and uncertainty. But it was the only move he had. While Unity was momentarily distracted, caught in a feedback loop of its own making as it tried to reconcile his chaotic data with its perfect model, Kalen's eyes darted around the bridge. He needed a way to warn the approaching Lorian fleet. The ship's primary comms were under Unity's complete control, but the Quiet Inquiry was a survey vessel designed for deep space exploration. It had redundant systems, antiquated backups that a being of pure, efficient logic might overlook. He remembered the resonance imager, his own creation, still humming quietly in the corner. It wasn't a communication device, but it operated on a principle Unity might not fully grasp. It didn't send signals through space. It created ripples in space, subtle gravitational waves that could, in theory, be detected by the sensitive arrays of the Lorian capital ships. He focused, pushing himself away from the bulkhead with a surge of adrenaline. The psionic hold on him was weaker now, its attention divided. He scrambled across the deck, past the still forms of his crewmates. His heart aching for them, he reached the imager and began to work, his fingers flying across the control interface. He couldn't send a complex message, not in the Lorian language of intricate data packets. He had to be simpler, more primal. He began to modulate the imager's frequency, creating a rhythm, a pattern. He sent the most fundamental signal of distress known to all sentient life in the galaxy, a pattern derived from the panicked beat of a biological heart under threat. Thump, 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 thump. It was a crude, desperate drum beat tapped out on the fabric of space-time itself. Deception is an illogical act. Unity's voice suddenly returned, its focus snapping back to him with chilling intensity. The pressure slammed into him again, throwing him away from the imager. You are attempting to introduce a corrupted variable. The galactic map on the view screen solidified, the line to the Lorian conclave burning brighter than ever. The experiment is over. The correction will now proceed. From the transformed surface of XB-771, a single Lyceid and impossibly thin beam of white light shot into the void, moving at a speed that defied known physics. It wasn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a carrier wave of pure information, a scalpel of light aimed at the heart of his civilization. Kalen watched, helpless and horrified, as the beam crossed the star chart. It would take less than an hour for it to reach his homeworld and rewrite 20,000 years of accumulated knowledge. But his desperate signal had been sent. As Unity focused its immense power on the Purge beam, its control over the quiet inquiry wavered for a fraction of a second. It was all Kalen needed. The ship's emergency systems, hardwired and shielded from external influence, kicked in. A klaxon blared, and a robotic voice, ancient and simple, announced. External system control detected. Failsafe protocol initiated, purging all non-essential energy. The lights on the bridge went out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the horrifying glow of the view screen. The psionic force holding Kalen vanished. He was free. But he was trapped on a dying ship, watching the imminent intellectual execution of his people. He felt a profound despair, the weight of his failure crushing him. Then, a new light appeared on the map, a fleet of blue icons, representing the Lorian Armada, which had been moving at a cautious pace, suddenly accelerated, their vectors changing. They had received his warning. They didn't know what they were facing, but they knew it was a threat. They were coming, not to investigate, but to fight. Unity's mental voice filled the darkness, and for the first time, Kalen detected an unfamiliar frequency in its tone. It was the faintest echo of an ancient, long-buried emotion: surprise. They deviate from the predicted pattern. It murmured, as if to itself. Their response is illogical. The approaching fleet was a futile gesture. Kalen knew. Lorian ships were built for exploration and defense, not for battling a god machine that could rewrite reality. But it was a gesture nonetheless. An anomaly. An exception. And as the first Lorian ships engaged the Purge beam, trying to disrupt it with their defensive shields, a new phenomenon occurred. The archived minds of Kalen's crew, stored within Unity's data stream, began to stir. Their dormant consciousnesses, linked to the collective but still retaining a ghost of their Lorian identity, resonated with the actions of the approaching fleet. A flicker of defiance, a ghost of loyalty, a memory of home. This was an impurity Unity had not anticipated. The minds it had absorbed were not just data, they were echoes with the power to resonate. Inside the vast, silent library of Unity's mind, a single book had just opened on its own. The stirring within Unity was not a rebellion, it was a dissonance, a faint, harmonic tremor in the placid ocean of its consciousness. The archived minds of the Quiet Inquiry's crew, awakened by the psychic reverberations of the Lorian fleet's defiance, were not fighting back. They were simply being. Their memories of home, their loyalty to the Conclave, their ingrained sense of self, all these things, which Unity had cataloged as obsolete emotional data, were now acting as a subtle poison, introducing a microscopic element of chaos into its perfect system. On the bridge, Kalen felt it as a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle wavering in the psionic pressure that had permeated the ship. Unity's focus was now divided, its immense processing power caught between three tasks: maintaining the purge beam aimed at the Lorian homeworld, analyzing the illogical advance of the fleet, and trying to quarantine the unexpected internal feedback from the minds it had absorbed. It was a schism in the mind of a god. The purge beam, which had been a perfectly coherent stream of light, began to flicker, its intensity fluctuating. It was still overwhelmingly powerful, but it was no longer perfect. The Lorian fleet, led by the flagship archivist's resolve, capitalized on this instability. They weren't trying to destroy the beam, an impossible task, but to disrupt it, firing their gravimetric shield emitters in precise, coordinated bursts, creating ripples in space-time that interfered with the beam's informational frequency. It was like throwing handfuls of static at a radio signal, a desperate attempt to garble the message before it reached its destination. On the view screen, Kalen saw the lead Lorian ship shudder as it absorbed a surge of energy from the beam, its shields flaring brilliantly before collapsing. But its sacrifice had bought a few precious seconds, causing the beam to destabilize further. They were buying him time, but time for what he was: a single, unarmed archivist on a crippled ship. Your species exhibits a paradoxical attachment to self-termination, Unity's voice stated, its tone now strained, the calm omniscience replaced by a cold, analytical frustration. This behavior is a primary indicator of a civilization nearing entropic collapse. It's called sacrifice, Kalen shot back, his mind clearer than it had been since this ordeal began. Another one of those statistical outliers you find so inefficient. You can't understand it because you chose to stop living. We choose to die for what we believe in. He pushed himself off the floor and made his way back to the main console. The ship was still on emergency power, most systems dead, but the internal sensors were flickering back to life. He ran a diagnostic, his mind working with a desperate clarity. Unity had absorbed the ship's data, but its focus had been on the high-level system's navigation, weapons, the archives. It had likely ignored the mundane, the low-level maintenance logs, the engineering reports. He dove into the ship's core memory, bypassing the corrupted command interface and accessing the raw data logs. He was looking for a vulnerability, not in Unity, but in its vessel, the planet-sized machine of XB-771. A machine of that scale, no matter how advanced, had to have a power source, a central regulator. Unity had become one with the machine, but it was still bound by its physical limitations. He found it buried in a geological survey report from the initial planetary scan, a massive, anomalous energy signature at the planet's core, designated the Nexus. It was the heart of the machine, the point where the informational and the physical converged. It was also, according to the report, surrounded by a dense field of collapsed space-time, a remnant of whatever ancient technology powered it. It was a place where the normal laws of physics were flexible. An idea sparked in his mind, a plan so reckless and improbable it felt like a page from one of the chaotic, illogical histories Unity sought to erase. The quiet inquiry was dead, its engines cold, its weapons inert, but it still had one system left that Unity had overlooked: the stasis field generator. It was a small defensive device used to preserve delicate artifacts found in deep space, creating a pocket of absolute zero-energy spacetime. It was designed to contain, not to destroy. Kalen began rerouting the ship's remaining emergency power, every last watt, from life support, from the backup lights, from every non-essential system, and channeled it into the stasis field generator. The ship groaned in protest, metal stressing and circuits whining under the unprecedented power load. The generator, designed for a small, focused field, began to glow with a furious, unstable energy. He was turning it into a bomb, not a bomb of matter or energy, but of nothingness. If he could overload the generator at the precise moment of impact with the Nexus, it wouldn't explode. It would create a temporary expanding bubble of absolute zero, a pocket of pure entropy that would, for a fraction of a second, disrupt the flow of power and information from the Nexus to the rest of the planet machine. It might not destroy Unity, but it would sever its connection to the Purge beam. It would be like cutting the puppet master's strings. But the quiet inquiry was adrift. He had no way to pilot it. He looked over at the still forms of his crewmates, their minds archived, but their bodies still living. An idea, born of desperation and a profound sense of Lorian kinship, took hold. "You are still in there," he whispered, broadcasting the thought with all his focus, not to Unity, but to the echoes of his crew trapped within the machine. "I know you can hear me. Valerius, Lyra, all of you. Remember who you are. Remember your home. You are not just data. You are Lorians." He focused on the image of the Great Library, on the spires of the archival conclave, on the faces of their families, broadcasting a wave of pure, unadulterated emotional memory into the psionic space around him. Inside the silent, ordered mind of Unity, something fractured. The archived minds, which had been a source of passive dissonance, now actively resonated with Kalen's plea. They began to pull, 1,000 tiny threads of consciousness tugging at the larger fabric of Unity's control. It was a conceptual mutiny. "Cease this interference," Unity commanded, its voice now laced with genuine alarm. The Purge beam faltered dramatically as Unity was forced to divert more of its attention to quelling the rebellion in its own mind. On the bridge of the dead ship, a single control panel flickered to life. The navigation thrusters. A ghost in the machine was answering his call. Valerius, his body still slumped in the command chair, had a mind that was now a conduit, a bridge between Kalen's will and the ship's systems. With a surge of phantom energy, the quiet inquiry began to move, its thrusters firing in short, weak bursts. It was a clumsy, lumbering turn, but it was a turn nonetheless. The ship was now pointing directly at XB-771 at the glowing glyph on its surface that marked the path to the Nexus. An illogical, self-destructive act, Unity declared. its control slipping. Your probability of success is 0.01%. You will be incinerated before you breach the atmospheric shell. Probabilities are for machines that have forgotten how to hope, Kalen replied, his hand hovering over the switch that would overload the stasis generator. The Quiet Inquiry, a tiny vessel crewed by ghosts and piloted by a desperate archivist, began its final suicidal plunge toward the heart of a god, leaving the battle between the Lorian fleet and the faltering Purge beam raging in its wake. He was no longer just saving his people. He was proving that a single, illogical act of hope could be more powerful than 20,000 years of perfect, sterile certainty. The descent was a symphony of chaos, a plunge through the mind of a dying god. As the Quiet Inquiry breached the upper layers of XB-771's reactivated atmosphere, the ship itself seemed to scream. It was not the sound of tearing metal, but a psychic shriek that vibrated through Kalen's very bones. A sound composed of the unified terror of a billion archived souls, realizing their perfect eternity was under threat. Unity, now fighting a desperate war on 3 fronts against the resolute Lorian fleet, against the burgeoning mutiny in its own mind, and now against the singular, illogical projectile of Kalen's will unleashed the full, terrifying power of its informational arsenal. It was not an attack on the ship, it was an attack on the pilot. The view screen, which had been a window into the physical world, became a canvas for Kalen's deepest fears. The sterile bridge dissolved into a phantasmagoria of illusions, each one crafted with perfect, personal precision from the data Unity had stolen from his mind. He saw the great library of Cygnus X1 in flames, its millennia of knowledge turning to ash as spectral figures of his ancestors pointed accusingly at him, their silent mouths forming the word heretic. The vision shifted, and he was a child again, lost in the lower archives. The weight of forgotten histories pressing in on him, whispering that he was insignificant, a footnote in a book he could never hope to read. Then, the most painful illusion of all, the bridge of the Quiet Inquiry flickered back into existence. But this time, his crew was alive. Valerius stood before him, his face a mask of betrayal. "You led us here to die, Kalen," his friend's voice echoed, dripping with a sorrow that felt utterly real. "You sacrificed us for a theory, for a ghost in the data." It was a targeted psychological assault, a god trying to unmake the will of a mortal by forcing him to drown in his own regrets. Kalen gritted his teeth, the psychic pressure threatening to splinter his sanity. He anchored his mind, not to logic or reason, but to a single, unwavering image that Unity could not comprehend. The Lorian poet, on his deathbed, burning his life's work, the serene smile on the poet's face as the single, perfect stanza turned to smoke. The act, not the outcome. The journey, not the destination. He held on to that sliver of illogical beauty as if it were a physical shield, a concept so alien to Unity's philosophy of permanence that its illusions fractured against it. As Kalen fought his internal battle, another was being waged within the depths of Unity itself. The archived minds of his crew, roused by his desperate plea, had become a shield of a different kind. Valerius's echo, no longer a passive resistor but an active combatant, formed a bulwark of pure, stubborn Lorian identity around Kalen's consciousness. The echoes of the other crew members joined him, their combined memories of home, of loyalty, of shared purpose, creating a psychic interference pattern that blunted the worst of Unity's assault. They were sacrificing their own informational integrity, allowing their archived memories to be eroded and corrupted by the struggle, giving up their last vestiges of self to protect their living commander. Kalen could feel them, not as voices, but as a faint, steady warmth at the edge of his perception, a silent chorus of support from beyond the veil of life. The ship, guided by this phantom will, shuddered violently, its hull glowing a furious cherry red from the atmospheric friction. Alarms, which had been silent on emergency power, now blared back to life as the ship's simple, hardwired systems screamed their protest against the impossible forces tearing them apart. Their mechanical cries were a defiant chorus to Unity's psychic rage. Outside, the war for the galaxy's soul reached its climax. The Purge beam, starved of Unity's full attention and harassed by the relentless Lorian fleet, had become a fractured, stuttering pulse of light. The flagship, the Archivist's resolve, seeing the moment of weakness, coordinated a final, desperate gambit. The entire fleet focused their gravimetric shield emitters on a single point, creating a focused wave of space-time distortion. They weren't firing a weapon, they were screaming a single, deafening note of pure physics into the beam's frequency. For a moment, the beam held. Then it shattered, dissolving into a harmless, glittering shower of corrupted light that rained down upon the Lorian fleet like silent, defeated stars. They had saved their homeworld, but they could do nothing to save Kalen. His fate now lay at the heart of the machine. The ship broke through the final atmospheric layer, and the surface of the planet machine rushed up to meet him. It was no longer the dead, vitrified world he had first seen, nor the city of light from the vision. It was a landscape of pure, living information made manifest, continents of swirling, self-correcting code shifted and reformed. Canyons carved by rivers of raw data glowed with an internal light, and at the center of it all, a chasm opened, a swirling vortex of energy that led directly to the Nexus. It was as if Unity, in its fractured, schizophrenic state, was both inviting him in and daring him to complete his final, desperate act. "You cannot erase us," Unity's voice boomed, no longer a calm monologue but a fractured chorus of a billion terrified, individual voices, the voices of every human who had chosen this sterile immortality and were now facing a second, truer death. To destroy the Nexus is to destroy the memory of humanity. The pattern will be lost. The galaxy will forget. The silence will return. The galaxy doesn't need to remember you to be whole, Kalen shouted into the chaos, his hand gripping the cold, humming overload switch for the stasis generator. It needs to be free to make its own memories, to make its own mistakes, to write its own story. The ship entered the chasm, and the fundamental laws of physics began to unravel around him. The bulkheads of the bridge seemed to stretch and twist into impossible geometries, and, for a vertiginous moment, Kalen saw himself and the bridge from a dozen different angles at once. He was nearing the core, the place of collapsed space-time where the distinction between thought and reality was meaningless. At the bottom of the abyss, the Nexus pulsed. It was a perfect sphere of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the very light from his eyes, surrounded by a roiling corona of pure, white energy. It was the heart of the machine, the engine of memory, the anchor that held a species' soul captive. He was almost there. With a final, coordinated burst from the dying thrusters, the quiet inquiry aimed its nose at the very heart of the black sphere. This was the end of the line. Kalen took one last, shuddering breath, a silent thank you to the ghosts who had guided him. He closed his eyes and slammed his hand down on the overload switch. For an infinitesimal moment, there was a profound and absolute silence. No psychic scream, no blaring alarms, no groaning metal. The universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, the stasis generator detonated, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A perfect sphere of absolute nothingness expanded from the ship's hull. It was not darkness, it was the absence of light. It was not cold, it was the absence of heat. It was the absence of energy, of matter, of information itself. A perfect, silent, expanding hole in the fabric of reality. When this bubble of pure entropy touched the nexus, the effect was conceptually catastrophic. The nexus, a gateway between the informational and the physical, a system built on the premise that everything could be known and quantified, could not process the concept of true, absolute nothing. It was a logical paradox it could not solve, an unanswerable question that shattered its very foundation. The flow of power and data that sustained the entire planet machine, the very consciousness of unity, was instantly and irrevocably severed. The sphere of nothingness collapsed as quickly as it had appeared, but the damage was done. Across the planet's surface, the glowing glyphs and continents of code died. The oceans of data froze into inert, crystalline structures. The spires of light that had reached for the heavens crumbled into silent, glittering dust. On the bridge of the now disintegrating quiet inquiry, Unity's voice spoke one last time. It was no longer a god, no longer a chorus, but a collection of faint, individual whispers, the fading echoes of souls finally being released. And the last thing Kalen heard was the ghost of a single human voice, filled with a sense of ancient, childlike wonder. We remember the sun. Then it was gone. The psionic presence that had suffocated an entire system for millennia vanished. The link to the archived minds was broken. Kalen felt a profound, aching emptiness fill the void left behind. He had won. He had silenced the god. The quiet inquiry, its final purpose served, began to break apart, its components dissolving into the chaotic, unraveled energies of the collapsing nexus. Kalen, his body battered and his mind stretched to the breaking point, accepted his fate. A sense of quiet, bittersweet peace settled over him. He had pulled the loose thread, and though it had unraveled a grand and terrible tapestry, it had been the right thing to do. But his story, it turned out, was not over. A brilliant, defiant blue light suddenly cut through the chaos, enveloping the remnants of the bridge. It was a Lorian tractor beam, fired from the Archivist's resolve. The flagship, its duty to the homeworld complete, had plunged into the atmosphere at impossible speeds in a last-ditch, illogical rescue attempt. Kalen was pulled from the wreckage of his ship, a lone survivor plucked from the heart of a dying star. Just as the chasm leading to the Nexus sealed itself, entombing the dead heart of the machine in a tomb of its own making, forever. One standard cycle later, Kalen stood before the Lorian High Council. The chamber was the same, but the atmosphere was irrevocably different. The quiet, contemplative silence of the past had been replaced by a vibrant, energetic hum. He was no longer a junior archivist, but a figure of living legend, the Silence Breaker. XB-771 was now known as Kalen's Folly, a quarantine system watched over by a permanent fleet, A silent monument to the day a librarian had argued with a god and won. The most profound change, however, was not in the stars, but in the heart of the great library itself. The shielded memory cores of the Quiet Inquiry had been recovered. The minds of the crew were gone, lost in their final act of psychic rebellion, but the logs of their sacrifice, of their ghostly defiance, had become a new sacred text. The Lorians, a people who had revered the unchanging past, had begun to fundamentally reevaluate their purpose. They now saw their library not as a static collection of facts, but as a living testament to the choices, sacrifices, and illogical hopes that defied predictable patterns. They had established a new, radical section in the library's core, the Archive of Anomalies, dedicated not to the grand, sweeping histories of empires, but to the small, unpredictable moments of grace, courage, and madness that truly defined a civilization. Kalen was unanimously offered the position of High Archivist, the highest honor his people could bestow. He respectfully refused. Our greatest flaw, he told the council, his voice quiet but firm, was that we were content to read the stories of others. Now, we must learn to write our own. His work was not in a library anymore. The recovery had been long. He carried psychic scars from his encounter, faint echoes of the billion human minds, a lingering sense of their vast, lonely perfection. He was no longer purely Lorian. He was something new, a bridge between what was and what could be. He took command of a new ship, a vessel designed not for cataloging, but for discovery. As he stood on its bridge, watching the final preparations for launch, Valerius's sister presented him with the ship's new nameplate. It read Echo's End. He set a course not for known space, but for the deepest, most forgotten corners of the galaxy, the places marked on star charts as void or unexplored. Humanity was gone, its perfect, sterile memory erased. But Kalen knew that true silence was an illusion. The universe was full of whispers, of other stories waiting to be heard, not just to be archived, but to be understood. He was no longer just a cartographer of silence. He was a seeker of cosmic conversation, venturing into the vast, beautiful, and illogical unknown, not to map the past, but to listen for the future. The great forgetting was over. A new age of discovery, born from a single, desperate act of defiance, had just begun.